Good evening, friends, colleagues, and fellow thinkers. I am honored to be here tonight to discuss an issue that is reshaping not only America's position in the world, but also the very foundations of our economic and political future. The title says it all: USA in panic, China's power play changes everything. Now, that might sound dramatic, but let me assure you, it is not drama, it is reality. And the panic we are seeing in Washington, Wall Street, and boardrooms across the country is not unfounded. It is the predictable result of decades of decisions that prioritize short-term profits over long-term stability. Let me start with a hook. What if I told you that the so-called American century, the one we grew up hearing about, the one politicians assured us would last forever, may have ended without us even noticing? That while we were busy watching headlines about scandals, sports, and stock tickers, China was quietly building a new global order, brick by brick, deal by deal, investment by investment. China's rise is not simply about GDP growth or about how many ships or missiles they have. It is about a structural shift in power. They are building infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Latin America while the United States debates whether it can even repair its own bridges. They are investing in renewable energy while the US still subsidizes fossil fuels. They are expanding trade partnerships while America isolates itself through sanctions and tariffs. And here's the truth: the panic in the United States is not about China threatening us with force. It is about China threatening the narrative, the story Americans have told themselves for generations, that we are the indispensable nation, the center of the world economy, the permanent leader. That story is cracking, and with it, the confidence of an entire political class. Now ask yourself, who benefited from this decline? Who made the decisions to outsource industries, to chase cheap labor abroad, to dismantle unions, to financialize everything instead of investing in real production? It wasn't the working people of this country. It was the corporate elite, the 1%, who enriched themselves while hollowing out the very strength that once made America competitive. So, when you hear that the US is panicking about China's power play, remember, this panic is the child of our own choices. Choices made in boardrooms and government halls, choices to prioritize profit over people, speculation over stability, ideology over realism. China didn't do this to us, we did it to ourselves. So, what is to be done? The answer is not to demonize China, not to fall into another Cold War, not to feed our people fear while ignoring the rot in our own house. The answer is to look honestly at ourselves, to rebuild an economy that serves the many and not the few, to reinvest in education, infrastructure, health care, and technology. If we continue to cling to illusions of permanent dominance, the panic will only deepen. Imagine a nation that once prided itself on being the world's unrivaled superpower suddenly finding itself questioned, not by war, but by a quiet, steady, and deliberate rival. That is the reality the United States faces today as China's rise exposes the depth of America's decline. For decades, Americans have been told that the United States is the beating heart of the global economy, the driver of innovation, and the center of political stability. But when you look at the world today, you begin to see that much of that narrative no longer aligns with reality. The panic we see in Washington is not irrational. It is the recognition that China has moved forward while America has stood still, distracted by internal dysfunction and the pursuit of short-term gains. Let me put it this way: while America has debated whether it can fix its crumbling bridges and outdated rail systems, China has built the largest high-speed rail network in the world, connecting cities across the country at speeds Americans can only dream of. While the US argues endlessly over how to fund healthcare or education, China has poured resources into expanding universities, building hospitals, and fostering research hubs that are now attracting global talent. This contrast is not about small differences in policy, it is about two very different visions of national development. Here's a hook for you. What happens when the student surpasses the teacher, when the very country that was once seen as an imitator begins to set the standards? That is the moment we are in. For decades, U.S. leaders dismissed China as a low-wage factory, a nation that could only imitate Western technology, never innovate. But today, the evidence tells a different story. China is leading in renewable energy production. It has outpaced the United States in manufacturing of electric vehicles, and it has become the backbone supplier of critical technologies, from solar panels to rare earth minerals. The United States, meanwhile, continues to pour billions into fossil fuel subsidies while lagging behind on green infrastructure. The panic is not just about economics, it is about the symbolism of decline. America once exported dreams, the dream of prosperity, the dream of opportunity, the dream of democratic strength. But what happens when the world sees a nation unable to control its own political polarization, unable to pass legislation without gridlock, unable to provide even the basic services that advanced economies should guarantee? At the same time, they see China constructing cities, modernizing industries, and extending influence across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The juxtaposition is stark. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth: much of this decline is self-inflicted. The United States chose to prioritize Wall Street over Main Street. It chose to ship jobs overseas to maximize profits for a small elite rather than reinvest in its communities. It chose to weaken unions and dismantle worker protections in the name of efficiency, while countries like China strengthened state-led planning to ensure long-term growth. In other words, while America chased quarterly profits, China built a generational strategy, and strategies built on decades will always outlast strategies built on quarters. Ask yourself who benefits from America's current economic structure. Who celebrates when U.S. companies shut down factories in Ohio only to open them in Shenzhen or Guangzhou? It isn't the American worker. It isn't the American family. It is the corporations and financial institutions that made billions from globalization while leaving their own country weakened. The panic today is the recognition that these decisions, justified as good for business, were catastrophic for the nation. And so, when you hear that China is rising, remember, it is not simply because China is extraordinary, though in many ways it is. It is also because the United States has failed to invest in itself, failed to take care of its people, failed to uphold the very values it claims to represent. China has not only exposed America's economic vulnerabilities, but it has also revealed the fragility of America's self-image. That is why the panic feels so intense. It is not only a fear of losing markets or military strength, it is the fear of losing the story America has told itself for generations, a story of unshakable dominance. What truly unsettles the United States today is not simply that China is gaining economic and military strength, but that its rise challenges the very story America has told itself and the world for decades, that it is the indispensable nation, the permanent leader, the model others must follow. Panic is not born from statistics alone, it comes from the collapse of a narrative. For generations, Americans grew up believing that their country would always set the rules, that history itself was tilted in their favor, and that no rival could ever alter this trajectory. But history has a way of humbling empires, and what we are witnessing now is that very process unfolding before our eyes. Here's a hook to consider. Imagine sitting at the center of the global table for decades, giving orders, setting the agenda, writing the rules, only to wake up one day and realize that half the table has quietly shifted their attention elsewhere. That is the anxiety gripping Washington today. The panic is about losing not just influence, but the image of inevitability. If other nations see alternatives, if they see China as a partner, a builder, an investor, then America's claim to leadership weakens, and with it, the ability to dictate terms. Narratives are powerful. They shape how a people see themselves and how the world sees them. For decades, the narrative of American exceptionalism dominated. The United States was not simply powerful, it was destined to lead. The end of World War II cemented that myth, the Cold War reinforced it, and the collapse of the Soviet Union seemed to prove it beyond doubt. Yet myths are fragile when reality shifts. Today, when leaders from Africa or South America look to China for infrastructure loans, technology partnerships, or trade agreements, it undermines the idea that America is the only path to development. The panic is not only in government offices, it is in the very identity of the nation. Consider how quickly the language in American politics has shifted. Not long ago, China was still described as a developing nation dependent on US markets. Today, it is spoken of as the greatest strategic threat, the one power that must be contained. Why such urgency? Because the narrative is cracking. When you no longer control the story, when you can no longer assure your citizens that their future will be unquestionably dominant, you begin to feel the walls closing in. And here is the irony: much of this panic could have been avoided if America had invested in its people rather than resting on the comfort of old victories. Instead, it assumed its supremacy was permanent, that others could never catch up. This overconfidence blinded US leaders to the fact that nations like China were planning long term, carefully and methodically building strength. When the cracks finally appeared in the American story, they appeared suddenly and all at once, leaving many shocked, as though no one could have predicted it. But history is full of these moments. See empires that believed they were eternal, only to find their narratives shattered by rising powers. The question now is not simply about competition in trade or technology, it is about legitimacy. Can the United States still claim to be the indispensable nation when its own infrastructure lags, its political system is paralyzed, and its citizens grow increasingly divided? Can it still sell the idea of endless leadership when other countries are visibly choosing different paths? These are not questions that numbers alone can answer. They strike at the heart of identity, and identity, once shaken, is difficult to restore. What truly makes this moment so destabilizing is that the world is watching. For decades, America told the story and the world nodded along. Now, nations are comparing stories, weighing options, and in many cases finding China's version more compelling. That shift in perception is the fuel behind the panic. Losing a market is painful, losing a narrative is existential. If you want to understand why the United States is facing this moment of vulnerability, you cannot simply look to China's success. You must look inward, to the very decisions made by America's corporate elite over the last half century. Panic does not emerge in a vacuum. It grows out of a recognition that those in power traded the long-term health of the nation for their own short-term profits. And when we trace the roots of today's crisis, we find them not in Beijing, but in boardrooms on Wall Street, in the executive offices of multinational corporations, and in the corridors of power where policy was shaped by the interests of the few at the expense of the many. Here's a hook worth considering. What happens when the people entrusted to build a nation instead dismantle it piece by piece, all while congratulating themselves for their brilliance? That is the paradox of the American elite. They claimed the mantle of innovation, efficiency, and global leadership, yet their choices systematically eroded the very foundations of America's strength. They outsourced manufacturing to cheaper labor markets, not because it made America stronger, but because it inflated corporate profits and shareholder dividends. They crushed unions, weakening the bargaining power of workers, not because it was necessary for national growth, but because it allowed executives to pocket a larger share of the pie. This was not an accident, it was a strategy. For decades, the corporate elite embraced a model of globalization that hollowed out America's productive base. Cities that once thrived on steel, automobiles, and textiles were left with shuttered factories and rising unemployment. Communities that once embodied the American dream were left behind, told to adapt to a new economy that promised prosperity but delivered precarity. Meanwhile, the very same corporations reaped record profits, reinvested not in American infrastructure or innovation, but in financial speculation and stock buybacks that enriched shareholders while doing nothing to rebuild the nation's capacity. The panic over China today is, in truth, the panic of an elite class realizing that their strategy created the very weakness their rival now exploits. By prioritizing cheap overseas labor, they handed China the opportunity to develop its industries, climb the technological ladder, and position itself as a global supplier. By undercutting unions and suppressing wages at home, they weakened America's domestic market, leaving workers with less income to sustain economic growth. By abandoning long-term investments in manufacturing and infrastructure, they left the nation ill prepared to compete when China began producing at scale. Ask yourself, was it inevitable that the US would fall behind, or was it engineered by choices that valued private gain over public good? The answer, though uncomfortable, is clear. It was engineered. It was the result of decades of deliberate decisions to privilege the interests of a small elite class over the collective needs of the country. And now, when politicians speak of a national crisis, they rarely point fingers where they belong, at the very institutions and leaders who orchestrated this shift. Instead, they deflect the blame onto foreign rivals, as though China alone is responsible for America's struggles. But let us not be fooled. The panic we see in Washington is not only about China's ascent, it is about the recognition that America's decline was a choice. The corporations that celebrated free trade agreements did so because they could exploit cheaper labor abroad while abandoning their obligations to their own citizens. The banks that pushed deregulation did so because they could gamble with the economy while expecting taxpayers to bail them out when things went wrong. The political leaders who enabled these shifts did so because they relied on campaign contributions from the very elite who profited. The great irony of this moment is that the same elite who cheered globalization now lament the consequences, as though they had no role in creating them. But history is not so easily rewritten. The American worker knows who abandoned them. The American community knows who left them behind. And the world knows that China did not weaken America. It was America's own elite who hollowed out the nation's strength, leaving the field open for others to rise. What we are witnessing today is not just a rivalry between two nations, but the unfolding of a deeper structural shift in global power. For decades, the United States assumed that it would remain the center of the world economy, the unquestioned leader in setting rules and shaping alliances. Yet history rarely stays still, and the rise of China is less about a single country's success and more about the rearrangement of the global order itself. The United States finds itself in panic because the tools it once used to maintain dominance, sanctions, military alliances, financial leverage, are losing their force, while China builds new tools that extend influence in ways Washington can no longer easily counter. Here's a hook worth thinking about. Imagine a chess game where one player continues to use the same moves that won past matches, while the other quietly changes the board itself. That is what China has done. The United States has relied on the old playbook, punishments, restrictions, threats, while China has redrawn the map of global economics by offering infrastructure, trade, and investment, and nations around the world are taking notice. Consider the Belt and Road Initiative, a project dismissed in its early years as overly ambitious, even impractical. Today it stretches across continents, financing ports, railways, and highways from Africa to Southeast Asia to Europe. For countries long neglected by Western investment, China presents itself not as a lecturer but as a builder. While the United States warns these countries of debt risks and political strings, many leaders see something tangible from China: roads where there were none, power grids where there were blackouts, and trade routes where there were barriers. It is difficult to compete with that kind of visibility. At the same time, China has emerged as a leader in renewable energy, investing heavily in solar, wind, and electric vehicles. While the US continues to argue over climate policy and pour subsidies into fossil fuels, China is shaping the industries of the future. This is not simply an environmental issue, it is a power issue. Whoever controls the technologies that drive the next century will also control the terms of global trade, influence, and development. The United States once occupied that position during the digital revolution. Now it risks ceding it to China in the green revolution. The response from Washington has often been defensive rather than innovative. Sanctions, tariffs, and restrictions on Chinese technology companies reflect fear more than strategy. They may slow China down in certain sectors, but they do not offer the rest of the world an alternative vision. For decades, America's influence rested not only on its strength, but also on its ability to inspire others to follow its path. But when the offer on the table is more punishment than partnership, the appeal diminishes quickly, and in the vacuum left behind, China's approach appears more pragmatic, more cooperative, and, in the eyes of many developing nations, more respectful. Another dimension of this structural shift is the changing nature of alliances. The United States built its dominance on military and political coalitions, NATO, trade agreements, and security pacts. China is building influence differently through investment banks like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, through regional trade blocs like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and through direct bilateral agreements. These are not alliances based on ideology, they are based on mutual economic benefit, and that makes them difficult to counter because they appeal directly to the material needs of partner countries. Ask yourself this: what happens when more and more nations decide that their future lies not in aligning with America's sanctions, but in embracing China's investments? The answer is already unfolding. Countries once firmly in the US orbit are hedging their bets, engaging with both Washington and Beijing, sometimes leaning more toward Beijing when the benefits are clearer. The structural shift is not a distant possibility, it is happening in real time. The panic in America, then, is the recognition that the old world is slipping away. The tools that once secured dominance are blunt, while the new tools of influence belong increasingly to China. This is not about a single battle over tariffs or technology bans. It is about the architecture of power itself changing before our eyes. And when the architecture shifts, it does not easily shift back. The loudest voices in Washington would have you believe that China alone is responsible for America's current state of anxiety. They will tell you that Beijing stole jobs, manipulated markets, and undermined US industries. But this is, at best, a half-truth, and at worst, a convenient distraction. The uncomfortable reality is that much of America's current panic is self-inflicted. The United States, over decades, chose a path that weakened itself from within, hollowing out its industrial base, underfunding its infrastructure, and neglecting its people. China did not make those decisions for America. American leaders, corporations, and policy makers did. Here's a hook that should make us pause. What if the greatest threat to American power was never outside its borders, but inside its own boardrooms and legislatures? For years, choices were made not to strengthen the country, but to maximize profits for the wealthy. The promise was that these profits would trickle down, that globalization would benefit everyone, that deregulation would unleash innovation. The reality is that these promises evaporated, leaving behind wage stagnation, collapsing manufacturing towns, and a growing divide between the wealthy few and the struggling many. Consider the infrastructure crisis. China, in less than 2 decades, has built thousands of miles of high-speed rail, modernized its airports, and invested in cutting-edge telecommunications. The United States, meanwhile, cannot pass a bill to fix its crumbling bridges without years of political infighting. Is that China's fault? No. That is the result of a political system beholden to corporate donors and paralyzed by partisan gridlock. It is the result of decades of underinvestment, justified by the myth that the private sector alone could solve public problems. The same pattern is evident in education and healthcare. While China has rapidly expanded universities, research centers, and training programs, the United States has allowed its education system to become increasingly unequal, burdening students with mountains of debt rather than empowering them to innovate. In healthcare, America spends more than any other nation yet delivers worse outcomes for large portions of its population. These are not external attacks, they are self-imposed wounds, the predictable outcome of policy decisions driven by profit rather than public good. And let us not forget the labor question. The hollowing out of the American middle class did not occur because China forced US companies to outsource jobs. It occurred because American corporations saw greater profits in chasing cheap labor abroad, and because policymakers allowed it to happen without protecting workers at home. Factories closed not because China demanded it, but because executives demanded higher margins. Wages stagnated not because Beijing dictated it, but because unions were systematically undermined and collective bargaining was weakened. The panic about lost jobs, in other words, is not about China stealing them, it is about America giving them away. Here is the bitter irony: by outsourcing industries and dismantling protections for workers, American elites effectively handed China the opportunity to rise. They opened the doors to a competitor's growth while weakening their own country's foundation. Now, as China leverages the very industries the US abandoned, Washington cries foul. But the rest of the world can see through the performance. The crisis is not about foreign sabotage, it is about self-sabotage. Ask yourself, what would America look like today if, instead of funneling wealth into stock buybacks and speculative finance, it had invested in renewable energy, education, and infrastructure? What if the trillions spent on wars had been spent modernizing industry, strengthening communities, and preparing for a multipolar world? The answer is obvious. The United States would be competing from a position of strength rather than reacting from a position of fear. The panic we see now is therefore less about China's strength and more about America's own reflection in the mirror. It is the realization that decades of neglect, greed, and short-term thinking have caught up with the nation. China's rise only exposes what was already true, that America, for too long, weakened itself from within. The real question is whether the United States can admit this truth, or whether it will continue blaming others for wounds it inflicted upon itself. The United States now finds itself at a crossroads unlike any it has faced in decades. The panic over China's rise has revealed not only external challenges, but internal choices that demand urgent reckoning. This is a moment where the nation must decide whether to respond with fear or with vision, whether to cling to outdated strategies or to chart a new course that rebuilds strength from within. The danger is real, but so is the opportunity. What the country does now will determine whether the coming years are defined by decline or renewal. Here's a hook that captures the gravity of this moment. Imagine standing on a bridge that is splitting in two, one side leading toward reinvestment and reform, the other toward hostility and stagnation. Which way will America step? The answer is not obvious, because the instincts of its leaders often pull in the wrong direction. Fear of losing dominance tempts them to pursue a new Cold War, to rally the public with talk of threats and enemies. But history shows that fear rarely builds, it divides, it isolates, and it blinds. If America chooses that path, it will waste precious time trying to contain China instead of repairing its own weaknesses. The other path is harder but far more necessary. It begins with acknowledging that the United States cannot remain globally competitive unless it reinvests in its people. That means rebuilding infrastructure so that American cities are not defined by potholes and collapsing bridges, while Chinese cities showcase modern transport systems. It means committing to affordable health care and education so that citizens are empowered rather than burdened. It means investing in renewable energy and advanced technology so that the industries of tomorrow are not ceded to competitors. The panic that grips Washington today can be transformed into resolve, but only if leaders recognize that national renewal cannot come from sanctions and military posturing alone. This crossroads is also about political honesty. For years, Americans have been promised that free markets would deliver prosperity, that globalization would lift all boats, that deregulation would create innovation. The reality has been different. Inequality has soared, job security has evaporated, and communities have been abandoned. If the United States is to compete in a multipolar world, it must confront these false promises and embrace policies that serve the majority rather than a wealthy elite. Otherwise, the panic will remain because the underlying problems will remain unresolved. Ask yourself what inspires confidence in the world today. Is it a nation that blames others for its struggles while failing to fix its own crises? Or is it a nation that looks inward, admits its mistakes, and begins the hard work of renewal? The United States still has enormous resources, talent, and capacity. But without a shift in priorities, those advantages will continue to erode. China's rise has made the choice unavoidable: either America reinvests in itself or it risks permanent decline. The crossroads is not only about economics but about vision. Will the United States cling to the myth of eternal dominance, or will it embrace the reality of a multipolar world where cooperation and competition coexist? The temptation to double down on fear is strong. Fear can be politically convenient, but fear does not build railways, does not educate children, does not cure diseases, and does not prepare a nation for the future. Only investment, cooperation, and long term strategy can do that. The truth is that America still holds the power to reinvent itself. The panic that dominates headlines today could be the wake up call that pushes the nation toward a new era of shared prosperity, but it requires a choice, one that cannot be delayed much longer.